I think it's a very emotional thing art can offer, and art in my eyes would be the authentic way to experience past and certain aspects of the city life in Berlin. It's acting on a different level, I'd say. I mean, it's automatically a very emotional approach, because I think you feel the power which is in these works, in the painting. I mean, of course, they were called the Junge Wilde, and that's not only a metaphor. It's a program. I think it's a manifesto. You know, they were wild and they were young, of course, and they wanted to provoke, and I think you can feel that in these paintings.
West Berlin had been walled in for almost 20 years when the Junge Wilde, or the Young Wild Ones, began working together in the late 1980s. Cold War mindsets had disseminated throughout the world, but there was nowhere quite as affected by the conflict as Berlin. Kreuzberg, a West Berlin neighborhood surrounded by the Berlin Wall on three sides, was where the Junge Wilde lived and worked. The images they painted reflect how the Cold War seeped into the lives of those who lived in the divided city. They also present a narrative that has largely been left out of the dialogues of history books, which mainly focus on the larger arcs of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, and the political climate of the time. Seldom are the stories told of those who lived among the wall. The Junge Wilde was made up of Helmut Middendorf, Rainer Fetting, Salome, and Luciano Castelli, and each painter captured their personal perspective on their environment. Their anthology of works serves as an example of how a global event can affect cities, neighborhoods, and those who lived there. In this case, the Junge Wilde present us Kreuzberg, Berlin, a neighborhood that was physically and culturally shaped by the Berlin Wall. However, the paintings don't present a parallel narrative to the Cold War. They depict a cultural microcosm completely endemic to Kreuzberg.
History books are always linear. It's organized usually chronologically, and you have a certain narrative voice, but not all history lends itself to a representation like that, because these images show much more like the rupture of history and the things that are happening that are kind of disruptive and that are chaotic, and you can't really represent chaos in a linear narrative. It just doesn't work. And these images, I think, especially with the colors, just give us much more of an inner expression of what they went through. And so they add something to the way that we know history, that they give us an emotional expression in a way that now seems political to us, because we look back at it and we're like, oh my God, they painted the wall. But for them, it's like, yeah, there's a wall, I'm going to paint it. So.
When tourists visit Berlin, they seem to gravitate towards the same few historical sites, aiming to understand a piece of the city's history through that place. Checkpoint Charlie, the East Side Gallery, and the Berlin Wall Memorial are of the most popular sightseeing spots in the city. Although each presents a different aspect of Berlin's past, they all fall short in portraying what everyday life was actually like. Instead, they show replicated and altered parts of the Berlin Wall. Paintings by the Junge Wilde can serve to supplement the inadequacies of these sites. They not only reference certain historical moments in Berlin's recent past, but they also show a more personal perspective on the city. They show that the artists weren't influenced so much by large political events, but rather their everyday realities. The Junge Wilde depicted Berlin as they saw it, and because of that, these paintings offer a completely unique perspective on the history of West Berlin. The trouble is that many people miss out on this aspect of the city's cultural history when they visit.
We have to be realistic. I mean, not everybody's interested in fine arts. Only, a fraction of the visitors in Berlin are interested, I think. Unfortunately, I mean, they seem to be attracted by rather superficial and very, emblematic places. I mean, I'm not a great fan of the East Side Gallery. I think it's important to have it. I think it's a good start, but if you want to go in depth, I think you should rather go to see a historical museum or go to an art museum like Berlinische Galerie to experience what that time has actually meant and what the wall meant to the artists who lived here when the wall was still up and when the city was still separated.
Checkpoint Charlie, the American-controlled crossing point between East and West Berlin during the Cold War, also fails to provide visitors with an accurate idea of what living in Berlin was like during the presence of the wall. Nonetheless, it attracts countless tourists every day. While the site does give a representation of what it would look like at the border during the Cold War, the guardhouse is a replica, the guards are impersonators, and the whole area has taken on a new meaning of American sector. In addition to the inauthenticity of these places, where they really fail is in presenting a false narrative about the city. Visiting Checkpoint Charlie during the Cold War was not necessarily a fun and exciting thing, and the East Side Gallery doesn't actually represent the confining nature of the wall because the art was added after Germany had reunified. Simply put, these places give visitors the wrong idea about the history of Berlin. Paintings by the Junge Wilde, however, don't provide this kind of false information.
And I think these images don't try to represent you within a ready-made narrative because they're images. So it's a very different way of representing the past, but from a very personal narrative. And I think usually what people respond to well is personal narratives. So they just kind of give this image and it's like, okay, this is an expression of an atmosphere, probably of a spirit of a time. And in a way, the interesting thing is these images all represent very different topics, but if you put them together, they communicate with each other in a very interesting way.
But what was the spirit of the time in Kreuzberg during the 70s and 80s? It was in fact very different from other parts of Berlin, even in the western half. To put it simply, although Kreuzbergers lived in a walled-off neighborhood, their confinement fostered an area of free-spirited individuals. Due to the high concentration of young artists in the neighborhood, creativity flourished. The consequence was a small pocket of Bohemia nestled against the western side of the Berlin Wall. But it is important to consider why Kreuzberg became such a cultural center. After all, the confluence of such a group of individuals did not happen by accident. In a way, Kreuzberg actually attracted these people to the neighborhood.
Well, I think historically it's interesting to analyze a bit Kreuzberg as a whole, as a neighborhood. It was relatively intact after the Second World War, so the bombings rather destroyed the southern part of Friedrichstadt, but not necessarily the main neighborhoods in Kreuzberg. So you had many old buildings which had survived. But on the other hand, it was not a very popular neighborhood to live in because it was so close to the wall.
The preference for more bourgeois neighborhoods in West Berlin resulted in a few groups of people who remained in or were attracted to Kreuzberg. Firstly, there was the older generation of working-class Germans, who slowly left Kreuzberg for other parts of the city. Then there was a large number of Turkish immigrants, who came to the city for a migrant working program in the 1960s.
So Kreuzberg was an area that was not considered very good to live in. And that allowed a third group to come in that I would call kind of a young German alternative culture. The term alternative being very broad, to encompass artists, a different type of underground culture, very important gay community, a vibrant political movement, squatting buildings, participating in social movements, and in reality the whole thing crystallizing in a very politicized and artistic atmosphere.
It was always known to be a very, I wouldn't say revolutionary, but a very resistant part of the city. You know, that's where the May 1st riots would happen. That's where the punks would hang out in the streets. So Kreuzberg has a very specific character for being kind of reluctant to follow the mainstream.
It's no surprise that these paintings convey such an intuitive look back at the environment of Kreuzberg. The painters in the Junge Wilde were a part of the alternative youth groups that Kalandides and Kohler mentioned. Being artists, their participation with culture was rather specific. They constantly attended and performed concerts, held exhibitions for their works, and even started a gallery of their own called Galerie am Mauerzeit. Kreuzberg not only provided a cultural playground for the artists to interact with, but it was also a place where rents were low, allowing them to have large studio spaces for their large paintings. Speaking with Helmut Middendorf, it became clear why that place and that time was pivotal for the group's work.
At that time, you have to see that slowly, culturally, the most interesting things that happened in Berlin were concentrated in Kreuzberg. Also the new painters, nearly all lived there, and we lived very close there, around Oranienstraße, around Oranienplatz, around Mauerzeit. And there were clubs and restaurants at that time, like the Exile, like the SO36 and so, where we went nearly every night and so, and that was also a kind of new communication, because all the artists went there, we heard the music, there was a new music there, was a new punk music there. Kippenberger lived already in Kreuzberg at that time, he was involved with SO36. We also showed paintings in the SO36 at that time, or painted directly on the wall. Mm-hmm. And then there was this restaurant Exile, where all the writers, actors, painters met. But you could also meet Joseph Beuys there, you could meet Robert De Niro there. You could meet, really, when there was a film festival in Berlin. So it was a very concentrated atmosphere, and you always had the feeling, here is the place where it happens, no? And that was important, that you thought you are at the right time in the right moment, because there were the right people in the right city, and that made everything so enormously productive. It kicked you on.
It's important to note that the proximity to other artists and creatives kept the Junge Wilde going. That creative momentum was quintessential to their work, both in their productivity and in the content of their paintings. So not only do these paintings give us a glimpse of West Berlin from the artist's perspective, but they also show us a time and a place that was unlike anything else. As Middendorf mentioned, the nightclub SO36 was a common late-night hangout spot for the artists. Martin Kippenberger, another prominent artist from the time, helped found the club, which immediately created a link between nightlife and the art scene. SO36 was also just down the street from Galeria Mauerzeit. This relationship is one of the reasons why Berlin's nightlife is so prevalent in the work of the Junge Wilde.
The things we did at that time could only happen in Berlin. They could not even happen in Munich. Or in Cologne or in Hamburg. It was a really very special thing if that could only happen in Berlin because of the situation, the background and so. And I always say, when the wall came down in 1989, this kind of period for this kind of painting was, for me, in a way over. Because the backdrop was gone. No, the whole atmosphere, the whole things, that really were interesting to do these huge paintings, and so it was really gone.
Middendorf was right about the effect that the Berlin Wall had on the conditions within Kreuzberg. The wall not only acted as a barrier to divide the city, but it also created an enclave where certain cultures could thrive. After the wall came down in 1989, these enclaves were lost and their cultures were diluted. Even though the spirit of Kreuzberg was changed, we can still access it through the works of the Junge Wilde. At the same moment the wall fell, the group's paintings transitioned from a reflection of the present moment to a form of historical documentation. Examining each artist and their work gives us a more focused look back at particular characteristics of the neighborhood. Salome's paintings largely highlight Kreuzberg's gay culture, as well as his relationship with it. Salome's pseudonym was actually chosen when he joined Homosexuelle Aktion West Berlin in the 1970s. Thus, his identity as an artist is directly related to the gay community in Berlin at the time. His works are not only significant in their ability to portray this microcosm as he experienced it, but they also present subject matter that had never been addressed so openly in painting. Castelli's paintings focused on figures as well, and although he was a painter, he was also a musician. Together with Salome, he founded the music group Geile Tiere, which translates to horny animals in English. The paintings depict his perception of those who attended his shows and engaged in Kreuzberg's nightlife. The two artists created various paintings together, combining their techniques and subjects into images that show us how the artists saw their fellow Kreuzbergers. Salome and Castelli's works are now so significant because they show us a unique mix of the people who contributed to Kreuzberg's free-spirited culture. In contrast to figures, Rainer Fetting largely focused on painting the Berlin Wall, which would not have even been allowed in East Berlin.
And this is probably where the Van Gogh painting also factors in a little bit, that it's like, I mean, the one thing, when you look at the Van Gogh painting, this is for me the one moment where I'm like, okay, we're in the West.
Fetting's Van Gogh and Mauer series can be seen as a reflection of his relationship with the Berlin Wall. We see Van Gogh, the archetype of the misunderstood artist, amongst the wall as Fetting once was. By comparing himself to Van Gogh in this setting, we can see how his relationship with the wall made a unique influence on his work. During the 1980s, Fetting created countless wall paintings, but just as Van Gogh may have been misunderstood, we are also met with some confusion from Fetting's wall paintings.
When you walk by Fetting's wall painting in the Berlinische Galerie, you need to spend some time with the painting. Because you could just like walk by it, but you kind of, when you look at it, then you're like, oh my god, it was actually when the wall was still up, and then you start looking at it more and more. And then, I mean, when I first stood in front of it, it was kind of like very puzzling to me, because I was looking for a different narrative, like, oh, where's the politics in this art? Where is the criticism of the time of the wall? And you just look at this wall and it's just very pretty.
So what do we do with Fetting's wall paintings? They challenge our expectations of the Berlin Wall and how it has been represented. Although it was a symbol of political division and control, it wasn't always considered to be so aggressive, as evident by Fetting's bright and playful colors. His paintings show us how a West Berliner saw the wall, not as a symbol of oppression, but perhaps just a strange architectural feature. Helmut Middendorf's paintings give us perhaps the most broad array of subject matter from Berlin. He painted everything from the nightlife and its individuals to Berlin's cityscape and architecture. One painting in particular, however, has garnered quite a reputation: Flugtraum. Painted specifically for the 1982 exhibition Zeitgeist, which included Joseph Beuys, Andy Warhol, and others in the Junge Wilde, the painting stretches an enormous 4 by 3 meters. The success of the painting is not necessarily in what the image shows, but what it can inspire in the viewer.
It's very interesting because the first image is almost of a crucifix. As a non-religious person, I see a religious image, first of all. I've got this cross on top, and then there's kind of a hellish kind of fire at the bottom, and this very, very dark night. And once again, this darkness. Again, this is what exactly my image of Kreuzberg at the time.
To others, the paintings sometimes conveyed different connotations.
And I showed it in Zeitgeist, and it was also because Joseph Beuys did this kind of mountain there in the middle of the building, and my plane was behind his mountain there. And Beuys has also his biography. He was a pilot, and he crashed with the plane, and then you have the plane with the Beuys stuff. And a lot of people had immediately the story of Beuys in their mind. It was very, 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 very funny. I liked that.
Even more, the painting harkens back to Berlin's involvement with World War II, Russian airplanes during the Cold War, and the air bridge that supplied the walled-off West with food and supplies. Regardless of the interpretation, Flugtraum is an example of how works by the Junge Wilde can be used to access Berlin's tumultuous past. The group created an anthology of works that depict some aspects of Berlin that simply weren't recorded in other ways.
Because there is little documentation about the actual experience of nightclubs during that time. These images kind of become such significant references for us. And I think it's in part, of course, they communicate something, but we also always bring something to the image. So
The resiliency of these works relies in the fact that the Junge Wilde painted their experiences. We can see the clubs they attended, the people they interacted with, and the places they went in Berlin.
That we painted the subjects if we were really interested in. And that was figures, that was the music, that was sexuality, that was not existing really in the paintings at that time. All this stuff, the architecture in Berlin was very important, that moved into the paintings.
Perhaps the most interesting aspect of these works as forms of historical documentation is their highly unique circumstances. Not only was the culture that they recorded unique to Kreuzberg, but the works also contributed to that culture. The neighborhood was thus a space that catalyzed both its characteristics and its own documentation.
That their art represents a very particular part of German history in a very particular time, but how significant places, really, and how they represent the place of West Berlin. And only in West Berlin could this place be represented in that way and actually become public.
The space of West Berlin was crucial in instigating both the cultural environment of Kreuzberg and the paintings that captured it. Although West Berlin was contained within a wall, its inhabitants did not seem to live confined lives. Perhaps that is why the Junge Wilde's circumstances were so unique.
I remember a bar we used to go to that's called Anderes Ufer, that was in Schöneberg, not in Kreuzberg, and there was a sign, a writing on the wall. They had kept a lot of the graffiti on the walls. There was a graffiti in the bathroom that said, "How come Berlin is surrounded by a wall and I feel free inside?" Yeah, something like that.